In the last years of her life, the most powerful woman in American society kept to a schedule. Each morning, in a shuttered mansion on Fifth Avenue, Caroline Astor met with her butler to go over the menus for dinners that were never going to be served. They reviewed the seating. They discussed the guest lists for balls that would never be held. In the evening, after her carriage ride through Central Park, she came home and received her visitors in an empty house. There were no visitors, the furniture was under dust covers, and the chandeliers were wrapped in netting. Her biographer described the great chateau as having fallen into a gloomy silence. For 30 years, this woman had decided who existed in New York and who did not. She invented the most famous list in American social history, and a family that failed to appear on it was, in the only sense that mattered to her world, not a family at all. Rockefellers waited, Vanderbilts waited, she kept the gate, and the gate held, until a 30-year-old woman from Alabama worked out exactly how to break it with a party invitation. This is the story of how Caroline Astor built a kingdom out of nothing but the power to say no, and what was left of her after the world stopped asking permission. She was born Caroline Webster Schermerhorn on September 22, 1830, in New York City, and the family called her Lena. The Schermerhorns were old Dutch merchant stock, part of the Knickerbocker gentry who had been in New York since it was New Amsterdam, and in the New York of 1830 that mattered more than money. Wealth could be acquired in a decade. Lineage could not be acquired at all. In 1853, she married William Backhouse Astor Jr., grandson of the fur trader and property speculator who had built the largest fortune in America. It looked like the perfect union of blood and money, and in the arithmetic of old New York, it very nearly was. There was one detail Caroline would spend the rest of her life declining to discuss. The Astor fortune was, at that point, only in its third generation. Her own future list would set 3 generations as the minimum requirement for admission to society. She policed a line she had personally cleared by a single step. The marriage itself was an arrangement carried out at a distance. William preferred his yachts, his horses, and the company of women who were not his wife. He appears in the record of her life mainly as an address and a bank balance. They had 5 children, 4 daughters and a son, John Jacob Astor IV, and Caroline turned the whole of her considerable intelligence toward the only territory available to a woman of her class. She decided to run society. She could not do it alone, because a lady of her standing did not give interviews, publish lists, or explain herself in newspapers. Around 1872, she found the man who would do all of that for her. His name was Ward McAllister, and for the next 20 years, he would be the voice of a woman who never had to raise hers. Ward McAllister was a lawyer from Savannah with a private income, an encyclopedic memory for pedigrees, and an ambition that had nowhere respectable to go. He organised subscription balls. He arranged Newport summers. He appointed himself the arbiter of American taste. And then he found a client whose authority was real and attached himself to her permanently. He called Caroline Astor the Mystic Rose. The arrangement was ingenious. McAllister talked to the press constantly. Caroline Astor almost never did. Every rule he announced carried her authority, and every rule that failed belonged to him. She became known simply as the Mrs. Astor, and the definite article was the entire argument. There were other Astors. There was one Mrs. Astor. She had won that title in a long, quiet family war against her nephew William Waldorf Astor, who eventually gave up, left the country and moved to England. Then came the sentence that defined an age. In an interview with the New York Tribune, McAllister explained that there were only about 400 people in fashionable New York society, and that if you went beyond that number, you struck people who were either not at ease in a ballroom or who made other people not at ease. The 400 was born, and every new millionaire arriving in the city instantly wanted on it. The number was fiction. The story that has been repeated ever since is that 400 was the exact capacity of Mrs. Astor's ballroom, and there is no good evidence for it. When the list was finally published in the New York Times in February of 1892, reporters counted it and found it fell well short. It contained roughly 213 families. Some entries were incomplete. Some of the people on it were dead. The most famous number in the history of American society was a round figure invented for a newspaper interview, and it worked because nobody outside the room could check. Inside the room, the rules were exact. Money had to be traceable back at least 3 generations. The annual ball was held on a Monday evening in January at 350 Fifth Avenue. And in 1890, Caroline commissioned an enormous portrait of herself in black satin from the French painter Carolus Duran, hung it in the hall, and took up her position directly in front of it to receive her guests, so that everyone who entered met the woman and the monument at the same moment. She had built an unassailable position. She had simply failed to notice that the fortunes arriving in New York were now larger than her own, and that one of them belonged to a woman who did not intend to wait 3 generations for anything. For 20 years the weapon had worked in one direction only. A woman Caroline Astor declined to visit was a woman with no standing, and there was no appeal, because the refusal was never spoken aloud. It was simply an absence. No card, no call, no acknowledgement that the house existed at all. The Vanderbilts had been living inside that silence for years, and their railroad fortune, enormous and recent, and earned in freight yards, made no impression on it whatsoever. In the winter of 1883, the silence stopped working. The instrument was a housewarming. A new limestone chateau had risen on Fifth Avenue, larger than anything the Astors owned, and its mistress announced a costume ball for the 26th of March. All of fashionable New York was summoned. In the Astor household, the youngest daughter, Carrie, had been practicing a dance for the occasion with a group of friends for weeks. She was 19. Everyone she knew was going. Her invitation did not arrive. When the household inquired, the explanation travelled back through the drawing rooms in the mildest possible language, and it was flawless. How could an invitation be sent to the daughter of a lady with whom the family had never exchanged calls? Caroline Astor read the situation exactly. Every option available to her was a defeat. To leave her card at that house was to concede, in the formal handwriting of the period, that the barrier she had spent 2 decades maintaining was a matter of preference rather than principle. To refuse was to sit in her own drawing room and explain to a 19-year-old that she would be missing the event of the season because her mother would not perform a 5-minute social ritual. The choice was between her authority and her daughter, and it had been designed that way. She ordered the carriage. It is worth pausing on what that ride actually was. The horses went up Fifth Avenue carrying a small rectangle of engraved cardboard, and when a servant carried it to the door of the house Mrs. Astor had spent years declining to see, the entire architecture of old New York quietly changed hands. She had ruled by never explaining and never yielding. She had now yielded in writing, in public, in front of everyone who mattered. She salvaged what could be salvaged. At the ball the 2 women were observed in long conversation, and the words attributed to her afterward were shaped to sound like magnanimity rather than retreat. There was no right, she is reported to have said, to exclude those whom the growth of this great country had brought forward, provided they were not vulgar in speech and appearance. It is a sentence with a blade folded into the last clause, and it is the most that pride permits when the position has already been surrendered. The consequence arrived faster than anyone expected. A barrier that opens once is not a barrier, it is a door, and every fortune that landed in New York after 1883 understood that the price of entry was patience and a large enough house. Caroline Astor held her throne for another decade on the strength of habit and reputation, but she was now presiding rather than ruling, and the man who had spent 20 years announcing her authority to the world was about to do something far more damaging than anything the Vanderbilts had managed. In 1890, Ward McAllister published a book. It was called Society as I Have Found It, and it was exactly what the title promised. 469 pages on the customs, menus, rivalries, and private machinery of the world he had spent 2 decades helping to seal shut. He seems to have believed it would be received as a monument to his own importance. To the people inside it, it was a servant selling the household keys. The old guard closed against him at once. Caroline Astor, whose entire method depended on never being explained in public, cut him off completely and barred him from her events. The man who had invented the 400 was struck off it by the woman he had invented it for, and he never recovered. On the 31st of January 1895, he died alone at dinner at the Union Club, at 67. The funeral was well attended. Society turned out, as society does. Caroline Astor did not go. A member of his own club supplied the epitaph. "Poor McAllister," he said. "What a pity he wrote a book." She had lost her voice, and the losses did not stop there. Her husband William died in 1892. One of her daughters died soon after, still in her 30s, and her old adversary, William Waldorf Astor, still nursing the family war he had lost, built a hotel directly beside her Fifth Avenue mansion for the specific purpose of overshadowing it. She refused to give it its name. She called it the tavern next door. By the time she came back out of mourning and opened her house again, something had changed in the room. The people were still coming, the deference was still there. But her authority was now a courtesy that others extended to her rather than a law they obeyed, and the difference to a woman who had spent her life reading rooms would not have taken long to register. Her son persuaded her to abandon the field entirely. In 1897, she left the house the hotel had ruined and built the largest ballroom of her life at the exact moment she had the least use for it. The new house stood at 5th Avenue and 65th Street, a French Renaissance palace by Richard Morris Hunt, finished in 1896. It was a double mansion, one half hers and one half her son's, with a marble staircase and a combination ballroom and picture gallery built to hold 1,200 guests. Caroline Astor, whose fame rested entirely on a list of 400 names, had built herself a room 3 times that size. The routine went with her, unchanged and exact. Every morning after breakfast, the day's meals were settled with her butler, Thomas Haid, who had been in her service since 1876, and with her companion, Miss Simrock. Correspondence was answered, calls were made and received. There were dinners and musicales to host, including a formal dinner for Prince Louis of Battenberg with Victor Herbert's orchestra playing. But the city outside the windows had stopped taking its instructions from this house. The new generation of hostesses had discovered that spectacle drew more attention than exclusivity, and the newspapers, which had once printed the 400 as though it were scripture, now wanted stunts and scandal. The Astor Ball remained a fixture of the season, the way a cathedral remains a fixture of a skyline, admired and rarely entered. Her last great ball was held in 1905. She was 74 years old. Afterward, the invitations went out less often, then rarely, and then not at all, and the woman who had spent 50 years deciding which doors in New York would open found herself on the wrong side of the only one that had ever mattered to her. What happened next is drawn from her biographer, Greg King, and it is the reason anyone still tells this story. Caroline Astor's mind began to go. The dementia came intermittently at first, and her memory retreated backward through the decades toward a version of New York that no longer existed, and a version of herself who still ruled it. What is remarkable is that the discipline never broke. The schedule of a great hostess survived the society it had been built to command. So each morning the butler came, and they discussed the details of dinners that would never take place, and reviewed the guest list for balls that would never be held. The names on those lists belonged to people who had died years earlier. In the afternoon, there was the carriage ride through Central Park, exactly as there had always been, and in the evening she came home to the great house on Fifth Avenue, took up her position, and received her silent, empty rooms. At one point in those last years, she became convinced that she was expecting a child, and gave instructions for a nursery to be prepared. Her mind had travelled all the way back past the 400, past the ball of 1883, past Ward McAllister and the lists, and the war for the gate, to a young woman at the beginning of everything. On the 30th of October, 1908, confined to her bed with heart palpitations, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor died at the age of 78. Her son and his wife had been at her bedside through the illness. In the final hour, only her daughter Carrie was with her. The newspapers understood immediately what had ended. The 400 did not survive her by any meaningful measure, and contemporaries treated her death as the close of an era in New York. 4 years later, her son John Jacob Astor IV went down with the Titanic, and the family's gilded age ended twice. Caroline Astor's power was entirely negative. She built nothing, funded nothing, wrote nothing, and led no cause. What she had was the ability to withhold, and for 30 years in the richest city on earth, that was enough to make her sovereign. The tragedy of that kind of authority is that it only exists while other people agree to want it, and the Gilded Age produced a generation who stopped asking and simply built bigger houses. The empty ballroom is the exact shape of what she made. A room measured in guests, with no guests in it. She had spent her life deciding who was allowed through the door, and at the end, the discipline held perfectly, and the room stayed dark. And every morning she planned a party for the dead. That is the fourth story in this series from the Gilded Age. The woman who finally beat her, Alva Vanderbilt, has her own story on screen now, and it ends somewhere nobody would have predicted in 1883. Tell us in the comments whether you think Caroline Astor was a tyrant, or simply the last defender of a world that was already gone.